I know they're both supposed to.
two people that one.
Yes.
Check 1 2 1 2.
Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in just 1 minute.
My lips look ridiculous. Yeah, I gotta fix this. Shit.
We're just going to give it 1 more minute, folks. We've got some legislators joining us online. Some are joining us in person, and it's a busy morning around here today, which was not initially anticipated when we scheduled this meeting. So thanks for bearing with us. Well, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started now. Thanks so much for joining us. As I said before, when we originally planned this meeting, and we've had it planned for quite some time now, we did not have session today. That's both a good thing and a bad thing. We've got a busy morning ahead of us, and legislators sort of trickling into the building, various meetings going on, but forced attendance in some ways. So really good thing. So we've got some folks online who are also legislators, part of the Bioscience Caucus, and we've got some folks with us in person today, and I suspect some folks will be coming in as we go through our morning. And so I thought we'd start off by just introducing ourselves as the chairs of the Bioscience Caucus. We've been around for quite some time now, sort of a spinoff of the Manufacturing Caucus, which is led by Senator Joan Hartley, who is the Senate chair of the Commerce Committee, recognizing that really the bioscience, life sciences sector in the state of Connecticut has just been growing. We've watched this upward trajectory for quite some time now, and it's very exciting. And we really wanted to act as not only a conduit between the legislature and the life sciences community, but also really seek to understand what issues the life sciences community is facing, what they need for continued growth and sustainability here in the state of Connecticut, and how we can help. So as a caucus, we examine pieces of legislation, scrutinize them for the life sciences sector. We bring pieces of legislation forward and proposals that we've heard about from the industry that could be helpful. And again, just sort of act as that conduit. So we're happy to be here, grateful that there is such a flourishing sector here in the state of Connecticut. I do think we're uniquely positioned here in the state, and just have such a beautiful state to live in, to grow a business within. And we're very fortunate that this is the home of many companies throughout the state. Certainly we're seeing increased innovation here, and just very exciting. So today we're going to be talking about genomics and cell therapy and the life-saving measures that scientists are taking to really understand genomics better, understand cell therapy, and really helping us into our future, extend lives, and combat terrible, terrible diseases. So can't wait to learn more about all of that today. But first, I'm going to turn it over to my Senate co-chair of the Bioscience Caucus, Senator Tony Hwang.
Thank you, Senator Cohen, and welcome to everyone and to the viewers. I'm excited to learn more about what innovations and advancements are afoot in Connecticut and in the industry. I think when you look at the genomics and gene therapy and cell therapy, it really is transformative. And I think that the term personalized medicine is such a powerful statement when people realize that you can make adjustments based upon each unique individual's needs and body compositions. It really is such a powerful opportunity for us to make a difference in people's lives. And that is the first and foremost. And when we're looking at the biosciences, creating a better life and quality of life for every individual. I think the other part of it is critical, is it's not to be understated, the economic influence in the state of Connecticut. Biosciences is a sector that will grow and be comparable to what past industries have been in the 22nd century. And Connecticut is well positioned, being positioned between New York and Boston, to really be an epicenter. If anybody knows the background of this, is the fact that the research triangle down in the Carolinas have been transformed the bioscience sector. And I hope maybe we can do that in the state of Connecticut, being maybe a research rectangle. But ultimately, it really is a commitment from the legislator to collaborate and partner with science. And it is focused on research development. It is focused on talent acquisition, but ultimately it is finding innovations. So for me, it's an incredible opportunity to be part of a bipartisan House and Senate collaborative leadership, because this is not about partisanship. This is about creating a better life for everyone. And if anybody needs a testament of how powerful we can be, is we don't need to look any further than to compliment Pfizer, a Connecticut-based company that found the COVID vaccine that saved millions of lives in the world. That's something in Connecticut we can be tremendously proud of in the bioscience sector. So I'm glad to be part of this. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks so much, Senator Wong. Yeah, so much to be proud of here in the state of Connecticut. And as I said, just so much innovation happening every day. And I think we'll hear more about that today. I'd like to turn it over to the House co-chair, one of the House co-chairs of the Bioscience Caucus, Representative Steinberg.
Thank you and good morning. I have to say I'm very excited to get the band back together again. You know, it's been a while, and ironically, the reason why we haven't met as regularly as we did was because of the pandemic, which was one of our biggest challenges in the bioscience sector. And think about where we might have been if it not had been the advances in some of the RNA vaccines that helped us accelerate taking care of people. And that's what it's really all about. And conceivably, Connecticut is in a sweet spot. Here we're talking about genomics today, something in which we might actually have a bit of a differential advantage that we can continue to build on. We keep talking about industry ecosystems where we're growing not just the core businesses, but the businesses that support them and supplement them. This is really important for Connecticut, not just for the Bioscience Caucus to sort of get its mojo back, but really for the state of Connecticut to continue on the path that we have been on for at least the past decade, whereby we are going to ideally be leaders, as Senator Wong said, in what we would call individualized or customized medicine, which really is the future. So many of the things we talk about would benefit from being able to prepare something that has been specifically targeted for the needs of the individual. And I'm hoping some of the things we'll hear today will give us encouragement that we are continuing along that path. There are many things we could talk about here in the state of Connecticut when it comes to the biosciences. And we hope in subsequent meetings, getting together more regularly to shine a spotlight on some of those other areas as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And now to turn it over to, for today anyway, the other House co-chair of the Bioscience Caucus, Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you very much, Senator. And I'm happy to be here today, subbing for Representative Yaccarino. He sends his apologies. He couldn't be here, and he was kind enough to offer me the chance to be here. I don't want to repeat what the other chairs have said. I mean, we have heard about the importance of this to the state, creating a center of excellence. But I want to talk about the effect you are going to have on those individual patients, those lives. And you offer them hope, you offer them life, you offer their families a line, a vision of a future that they didn't see before. So I think from that point of view, what you're doing is so important and so almost holy. You are creating life and hope where there wasn't any. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say today and to thank you. Everyone sitting in this room knows someone who has been given that life sentence, death sentence, and you are taking that away. You are giving them hope. You are giving them the possibility for the future they had not imagined. So I can't wait to hear what you have to say, and I look forward to this expanding and taking this hope and opportunity to the residents of our state and throughout the world. So thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, but I do just want to mention to all of the legislators here, if we could just let our presenters get through their presentations, then certainly those on Zoom, feel free to raise your hand as you normally would on Zoom, and in person indicate to one of the chairs that you'd like to ask a question or speak, and happy to allow that today. Again, we do have a time constraint. I think we've got an hour left today to get through some great presentations and to have a little period of Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to Laura Srebnick, the Director of State Government Affairs at BIO. Welcome, Laura. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Like Senator Cohen said, I'm Laura Srebnick. I'm the Director of State Government Affairs for the Eastern Region for the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. I just wanted to say we really appreciate the Bioscience Caucus for hosting this briefing on the transformative potential of gene and cell therapies. So thank you for that. And we have a wonderful panel here today to speak to you on that topic. So just a tiny bit about bio before we go ahead and turn it over to our panelists. BIO is, like I said, the world's largest trade association of biotechnology companies, academic institutions, as well as state biotech centers and related organizations like BioCT, who will speak after me. We are based in DC, National Trade Association for Biotech Companies, and we are also in 30 countries. And we have everyone from like the Senator Huang said, Pfizer, all the way down to small companies that are just getting started. And we're involved in 3 core areas, so healthcare, life sciences sector, as well as agriculture and environment. So again, thank you so much for being here and hosting this briefing. And with that, I will turn it over to BioCT.
Good morning. I'm Jody Gillen. I'm the president CEO of BioCT as of 4 months ago. As opposed to Bio that represents the nation, BioCT is the trade organization that represents the life science industry focused solely on the state of Connecticut. Now, Bio asked me to come today to share statistics on Connecticut, and I said, yes, I'll come, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I want to talk about today actually is why I joined the rare disease space over a decade ago and why I had committed myself to cell and gene therapy. So it was actually in 2014 that I was heading the chief medical office of a large pharmaceutical company. And it was a really interesting time. At that time, the company went from a primary care focused organization to oncology focused, and they needed to develop a policy and process for compassionate use based on the pharma FPA code, which was initiated at that time. Now, compassionate use is when an individual has absolutely no options left, and then they put in a request to a pharmaceutical company so that they can have access to a life-saving medication. So in reading all those letters that came from parents, from patients, from physicians, even from senators, it really was a game changer for me that completely changed my career and actually brought me to the state of Connecticut. These letters came, and what was highlighted in them was the diagnostic odyssey that most people face, especially in the rare disease space. The average time from diagnosis is anywhere between 4 to 10 years. So that's the first step, first chasing a diagnosis, going from specialist to specialist, hospital to hospital, often going around the world just to be able to obtain a diagnosis for their disease. Then after that, after they finally have a diagnosis, most patients will find that they have no options or limited options. And the amount of research that they have to go into finding options is really what was motivating to me. Most of these individuals who wrote these letters had no scientific background. They had to understand, is there a therapy on the market? Yes or no? If not, is there a clinical trial? Where can I find it? Can I travel to somewhere in the world to be able to obtain it? And then if not, what molecules exist that maybe could be repurposed for my disease? And it was amazing how much they had to understand that maybe a phase 1 product and the mechanism of action of that product might work in that particular disease. And then they had to put together the request to even ask for that product. So I think just understanding that diagnosis and what goes into even having a molecule and the entire journey along the way until once there actually is being able to have access to a molecule that might work is something that stays with me. And that's why I decided to join the rare disease space. And that's why I actually ended up in New Haven at a rare disease company. And what I try and do is make sure that I have the photos of patients always around me in my office, the photos of caregivers, and remember the people and remember the story. And that remembering too, that when we're making these decisions, in offices behind closed doors, they're affecting people and who they're affecting and keeping those stories with me. So there are two I want to share today as we go into this session. The first, and ironically, it's why I actually stopped wearing makeup. I was at a rare disease hospital in the UK, an incredible institution. And it was a patient meeting on a renal disease. And a 14-year-old boy came up to me. And at the time, I had a son who was almost 14 at the time. So he just really touched me. And he said, you know, I'm going to study to become a pediatric nephrologist so I can cure my disease. He walked away and his mother walked up to me and said, unfortunately, unless you get your drug to market faster, he's not even going to live to 18 and be enrolled in university. And it's these things and these experiences that it's impossible to become desensitized to. And I used to have to run to, you know, the ladies' room, ball, come back and be composed. But it's these stories that I like to carry with me as I make decisions. The second that stays with me, it was actually at a rare disease gene therapy company. And it was a father who was heading a patient advocacy group, and he had two boys with a horrific disease, mucopolysaccharidosis. And I think what touched me about this disease is children are born and they're meeting all their milestones, but by around age 3, they start regressing and going backwards to the point that they can no longer talk, they can no longer walk, they can no longer eat, drink, function, and they typically don't live to their teenage years. And the father was advocating, and he used to call me often, and I had to start taking the calls from home because I was being very honest. And he would say, I'm sorry I'm breaking down. I'm sorry I'm putting all this pressure on your company. And I thought about it, and I remember saying to him, if it was my child, I would be standing outside your office proudly following you home. And that's what I try and do as I make decisions, think, and these are thoughts that cause me even to shudder. What if it was my child? What if it was my partner? What if it was my parent? And I think we have to be realistic, though, that we can't offer everything to everyone. But just remember that when we make these decisions, they are impacting families and what they have to go through. And I think we really have to look at data and look at the journey along the way, too, that not everything can be offered to everyone. But if they get there, if they get to the point that they finally have an option, can you only imagine if they couldn't access that option after that point? And what would we do? And I think we like to, or maybe not even like to, but sometimes we forget when we're in offices that we are impacting these decisions. We are impacting and even who lives and who has a chance of a potentially life-saving therapy. So I just would urge everyone that as we make these decisions, keep thinking, what if it was one of my family members, as you brought up today? And I really just want to conclude by thanking the caucus by hosting us and thanking all the policymakers on the phone. I have seen many of you at our events the last few weeks, and you're not only showing up for a minute, you're showing up for hours, you're staying engaged. And it's such a testament to the commitment we have here, the level of engagement, and we can't thank you enough for that. And I also want to thank all the folks that came out and came up to Hartford today to lend their support. The last time I was actually in this building was on Rare Disease Day, so it's quite meaningful to me. So thank you.
Thank you. My name is Michael Recht. I am a pediatric hematologist, and I am on the faculty of Yale University School of Medicine, where I see children and adolescents and young adults, and sometimes adults, who have rare inherited blood conditions, mainly bleeding disorders like hemophilia and von Willebrand's disease. And what I want to thank you very much for this opportunity to chat, to tell you what's going on in this world right now, and to tell you a little bit about my story and why I'm so passionate about this field. So we know through the Human Genome Project that there's over 20,000 genes in the human body. And from those 20,000 genes, we know of about 6,000 genes that can cause human disease. We also know every year that that number keeps growing as the technology gets better and we're able to diagnose people that we weren't able to diagnose before. The number of genetic conditions that are discoverable continues to grow and grow. Now, when we think about rare genetic conditions, we say that 1 in 10 people in the United States has one of these conditions, and that makes it seem that so many people are walking around with inherited conditions. And that might be true by the numbers, but by impact, there are some of these conditions that are so rare that, you know, maybe 10 people in the United States have something like this. And then there's that entire other population that are just haven't been able to be diagnosed yet. And that's really what we're working on. For all of these inherited conditions, there's only about 5% that have any kind of approved therapy. So we work very closely for my research, both at Yale and through some big interinstitutional consortium that I help lead with the FDA. Dr. Peter Marks, who used to be at Yale, and I remind him he was my attending when I was in training, and he doesn't love that. He runs the Center for Biologic Evaluations and Research. So his division is in charge of evaluating and approving these new medicines. That's also the division that approved the COVID vaccines a couple of years ago. So I guess sort of the takeaway from what I want to say with this background is the way we take care of people with these inherited conditions is really going to be revolutionized over the next couple of years. So broken genes, to bring it to its most basic, broken genes lead to broken proteins leads to cells that don't function, cells that don't function lead to problems with health. And it's really fixing these genes that are going to lead us to be able to cure some of these conditions that we haven't been able to in the past. So in its basic, gene therapy is the technology that allows us to go into the human body and replace the function of the broken gene with a gene that works. Currently, there are a couple of ways to do this. There are the in vivo and the ex vivo approaches. So that's sort of my club language, right? To make sure that I'm fancy enough that people don't know exactly what I'm talking about. So in vivo means I put something into someone's body to fix it. Ex vivo means I take something out of the body, fix it outside of the body, and then put it back into the body. So with in vivo approaches, what we're doing is essentially supplying the working copy of a broken gene directly into the body. With ex vivo approaches, we put that working copy of the gene into a cell in the body and then infuse that back into the body. Cell therapy is a little bit different. Cell therapy takes specific types of cells out of a person's body, either stem cells or mature cells, or cells that have been modified in the lab, engineer them so that fixed gene is inside those cells, and then administer those cells back to the person. So hopefully that new gene starts working. As I said, the FDA regulates these genomic medicines through the Center for Biologic Evaluations and Research. Any company that is doing research using these type of medicines works very closely with the FDA to go through all the steps that's appropriate to make sure not only that they work, but that they're safe. And I'm going to get back to the importance of safety when we're talking about these new medicines. So there's multiple steps that the FDA goes through. I'm not going to bore you by talking all the hours I sit in front of a panel that looks just like this, but with FDA officials in it. The thousands and thousands of pages of electronic paper that gets filed with the FDA to get approval. But I really appreciate the work that the FDA does, because their job is to protect our citizens and making sure that the medicines that we are developing to transform lives actually are safe to do that. So over the past couple of years, you can go to the next one, yeah. Over the past couple of years, we really have quasi-revolutionized the way we're able to treat some of these diseases. Currently, there are 32 FDA-approved cellular or gene therapy projects. In my field, just in the past year, 2 gene therapies for hemophilia have been approved, one for hemophilia A, the other for hemophilia B, and those are just, hemophilia A is when you're missing one blood clotting protein, hemophilia B is when you're missing another blood clotting protein. And by 2025, we expect that there's going to be 10 to 20 new gene or cell therapies approved every single year. So you can go to the last slide I'm presenting. So really, these are all the different fields where cellular and gene therapies are having an impact, where there are studies ongoing or where there are medicines approved. And you can see, if you look through this, it's pretty much everything. Like every body system is going to be impacted by these new types of therapy. So why am I here? I started my career taking care of kids with inherited blood disorders all the way back in the early 90s. There had been a revolution in the way we took care of people with hemophilia in the late 70s and early 80s, where the blood proteins that people were missing because of the genetic variant they had were able to be purified out of plasma. And as we obtained those plasma concentrates that contained the missing clotting factors, we also purified HIV and hepatitis C into those medicines. So in the late 70s and into the middle 80s, about 75% of people with hemophilia were infected with HIV. And of those, about 75% of people died. I started taking care of children with hemophilia in 1992 down at the Children's Hospital at Yale. There wasn't a Children's Hospital there in 1992, right? We were on a floor somewhere in that big institution. And that first year, I took care of dozens and dozens of children who died from HIV because they had taken the recommendation of their doctor to use these factor concentrates. In the early 90s, recombinant clotting factor concentrate was approved by the FDA. Recombinant proteins are when the proteins are made completely outside of the body and purified and then administered. So no chance of giving a viral infection. But obviously that had an incredible impact on me. And that's why I talked about the importance of safety. As much as these new therapies are amazing and life-changing, we have to make sure that they're safe as well. And that's really what I've dedicated my professional career on, is not only advancing the field in terms of developing new medicines, but making sure that these medicines that we're developing are safe. We never, ever want to do what we did to the hemophilia population in the past by infecting them with HIV. So I've been involved with multiple efforts to get new drugs approved, including the gene therapy drugs that were approved this year. But I'm also involved in the largest study of people with inherited bleeding disorders in the world. And we are following the safety of all these medicines too. So for example, during the clinical trials for the gene therapy medicines, the companies follow people out to 5 years after they get their gene to make sure there's no adverse event. I know that's not long enough. So the study that we're running is following people for up to 25 years. So it's a big, long study. that is going to ask a lot of the people who are getting these therapies to continue to come in and stay on the study. But it's the only way we're going to be able to figure out that the medicines are safe. There are new therapies for other hematology indications as well as including sickle cell. And sickle cell is a condition where just a single variation in one gene completely changes how your red blood cells, the cells that carry your oxygen, are formed. And that change can have an impact on every single body system that you have. And there has not been huge advances in sickle cell research up until like the last 5 years. So what I'd like to do is introduce our next speaker, who's going to talk about what it's like to have a condition that might be impacted by these new therapies. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Luzibu, and I suffer from sickle cell disease. So I just want to tell a little bit of my story and kind of talk about what it's like to live with sickle cell. So I was diagnosed with sickle cell at 9 months old, and for most of my childhood, I was okay. I was being seen and monitored, but things were going okay for me up until I was about 14, which is when I had my first pain crisis. So pain crises often feel like you're being stabbed in one or multiple parts of your body. Sometimes it feels like you're being squeezed by a vice. And really the only treatment for that that's available is narcotics. So we take narcotics either at home or we need to go in and we have a pain plan at our hospitals where we get these treatments, and that's pretty much all that's available right now for those to treat that pain. So having these gene therapies would be so beneficial and so helpful for people like myself living with sickle cell. I just want to talk about a little bit more about myself. So in December of 2020, excuse me, I ended up going in to the hospital for a pain crisis. I thought it was a regular pain crisis and just kind of my day-to-day life. And I went in on a Thursday, and because of COVID protocols, I was unable to have my husband or my family members there with me, but they were on the phone with the doctors and the nurses, and they were informed that I'd be monitored for another night or so, and I'd be discharged on Saturday morning. Unfortunately, on Friday night, I ended up having 2 seizures. I had a stroke, respiratory failure. I ended up in the ICU. I was put on a ventilator. They found blood clots in my lungs. It was all of the things kind of went badly all at one time. And I was alone dealing with this. And it wasn't only traumatic for me, but it was traumatic for my family, being so close, being just a few minutes away from the hospital and being unable to be there with me and for me, being unable to be there to advocate for me, and to make sure that I was okay. But I made it through that, and I was able to come home. But as many of you see, I'm walking with a cane. And that's just another complication that I've gotten because of sickle cell. So I now have avascular necrosis in both of my hips, and it is extremely painful. It's excruciatingly painful, and it just keeps getting worse. I'm at the point now where doing things like bending down or like to pick something up if I drop something, simple life functions, standing up to cook a quick meal, are so painful, and I end up having to go to bed early because I'm in so much pain. And the treatment for that is to have a hip replacement. And I'm 34, and I am ready to have a hip replacement. Now, I just kind of want to have you think about that, about what it feels like for someone who's 34 years old and already gets poked and prodded and is already in the hospital more than anyone would like to be excited to get a hip replacement. And joint replacements really only last for about 10 years. So God willing, if I'm here for a long time and I'm able to grow old, I'm going to have multiple hip replacements, probably in both hips. And having surgery infection is already such a high risk for people with sickle cell. So that's just kind of a little bit about myself. And as for these gene therapies, I'd also like to just kind of put out there, as Senator Huang was saying earlier, these gene therapies are great because they are unique to each individual. And that's really how a lot of these disorders are. Speaking about sickle cell specifically, even within multiple people who all have sickle cell, it's different for every person. Every body is different. Everyone's experience with sickle cell is different. And so being able to have a therapy that is catered to you specifically and specifically to your needs would be amazing and would really help our outlook on our futures and our lives. And so I'd like to advocate that those therapies also become available to anyone who needs it. I know with sickle cell, if and when these therapies are approved, that they may be available to those patients who don't have a sibling match. Because right now, the cure that's available for sickle cell is for a bone marrow transplant with a sibling match. But that can come with other issues. That can come with your body rejecting the bone marrow. And so these gene therapies would just be much better as it's your own genetic material. So I'd definitely like to advocate for that. Me personally, I have 2 siblings. I don't know if they are genetic matches for me, but I would much rather sacrifice 30 days in the hospital and have one of these therapies than to have to put my sibling through a bone marrow transplant and all the things that they have to do, and still have the high possibility that my body would reject that. And then now I'm kind of back at square one. I've already been through so much, and it's just not something that I'd be willing to undertake. So I just want to thank you guys for coming and for listening to me, and for being able to listen to me and put a face to some of these conditions that we live with every day. And thank you.
Good morning. My name is Michael Heifetz. I'm a number of things. I'm a former Medicaid director in the great state of Wisconsin, also former state budget director there, and also ran a Medicaid health plan in a separate state. So I've come at this from a number of angles over my career. But right now I'll just refer to myself as the buzzkill, because you just heard from a patient directly from Luzibu about her story and all that goes into that. And you heard from Dr. Recht talking about the science of it from that level. And as a consultant for bio, I get to come in here and talk to you about the public policy aspects of this. And Luzibu said, her real request is to provide access for these wonderful therapies as they come on down the pipeline. And we have to figure out how to pay for that. So some of what I say will sound a little bit, well, it'll definitely be non-scientific, but it will sound, sometimes a little cold because it gets into data and how well do these work and clinical trials and payment reform and reimbursement methods and state Medicaid policy and all those kinds of things. But what you heard from Luzibu and Dr. Recht is really the key element, as well as some of Julie's stories that she carries with her. And I think now that I'll be carrying some of those with me as well, as aside from my own. So with that, let's just talk a little bit about some of the regulatory side and the difficulties in that regard. And the science, as we've discussed, has advanced rapidly. That pipeline slide a couple of moments ago talks about 10 to 20 of these being approved a year starting in 2025. That's really a key element of this entire conversation, because that is what's going to drive the access dynamics and the reimbursement payment dynamics. But right now, the public policy lags a bit behind all of that. We have fee-for-service systems in various states and various commercial markets. Even the managed care side doesn't necessarily address these issues in the way that's most progressive. And we're trying to catch up. So the federal government, we have Stark laws and things like that, and Medicaid best price that sometimes get in the way of some of these things. But I'll talk about that a little more in just a moment. And we have, from the industry itself, sometimes are innovative payment methods. And a lot of that revolves around value-based purchasing. In this realm, it's outcomes-based arrangements. And you can see a couple of those on the screen. And the outcomes-based arrangements is really to address a situation where perhaps the treatment doesn't work as expected clinically, and that there are objective ways to measure how a patient is expected to respond to a treatment. As you look at the clinical trials, some of them have great response rates, and some of them have not as great response rates. So how does a government or a private payer decide who gets this, who doesn't get it, when the cost could be high, but the effectiveness may be limited or unfortunately not as great as expected? So an outcomes-based arrangement in a simple form really just means if it works, this is fantastic for everyone. It's fantastic for the patient, most importantly, and it's better for the payer system because they're paying for something that is of extremely high value, regardless of cost at that point, potentially. And if it doesn't perform as expected, according to objective measures, then there will be some form of rebate, refund, reduced price, something in that nature. And there are different ones around, and the commercial side is addressing this perhaps a little faster than the public side. There are also other mechanisms, risk pooling. There was a lot of risk pooling around the country prior to Obamacare passing last decade. But and oftentimes for patients with difficult conditions and expensive conditions that the so-called normal market just wasn't built to handle effectively. And there are also subscription models, most commonly used from what we've seen in the hepatitis C universe, and sometimes in Medicaid programs as well. But that's the Netflix model, we like to call it. So you get that unlimited access regardless of the number. So they're all revolving around value. They're really trying to get at that payment component and the value component of things that can be a bit pricey, particularly for a state government and a Medicaid program that has to be managed with limited resources, frankly, no matter what state you're in. And we'll take the next slide. So I've talked a little bit about some of these challenges. You can see them on the screen. State plan amendment is an answer to some of those challenges, as are the demonstration waivers and federal legislation. Waiting for federal legislation, this is a nonpartisan comment over 30 years of looking at the federal government. That can be a difficult thing. Things just take a long time. And there is legislation out there now in Congress to address OBAs and to allow them and almost encourage them. But that's a slower go. CMS, the federal agency with responsibility over Medicaid and Medicare, has some flexibility as well through the approval of state Medicaid plan amendments, which simply allow states to engage in outcomes-based arrangements. Doesn't require a state to do so, but it simply gives them the platform and the permission from the federal government, given the federal government's role in Medicaid, to pursue these. The reason that's needed is because of Medicaid best price and other regulations that impact how reimbursement is managed and how it's structured. And outcomes-based arrangements really are a curveball for those regulations and for the federal legislation as it exists today. So even well-intended, things need to change at the federal level through state plan amendments or through legislation to allow these outcomes-based arrangements to come to fruition and to expand the access, which is really the goal of a different pricing mechanism. It's to responsibly allow state governments and other payers to cover these amazing therapies without breaking your bank and taking from other priorities that all of you have to deal with in your daily lives as legislators. And really, as a former budget director, you are the appropriator. I was the executive branch. I was not the appropriator, but you are the appropriators, and you have to make those difficult decisions, and then we administer them. Portability is a sensitive issue because it can be difficult to change insurance, as all of us have done throughout our careers, probably. It can be difficult. You don't know necessarily what is covered, what your copays will be, all those kinds of things that you have to evaluate for you and for families. And it can be even more difficult if you're coming from a Medicaid program and then going to the commercial side, because Medicaid typically or universally has fewer copays, obviously, because of the nature of the program, but oftentimes has fewer regulations and fewer hoops. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't hoops, and we'll talk about that momentarily. So that issue has not really been fully addressed. There is portability in the law. There's the HIPAA law from the 1990s, I believe it is. I was actually around for that. And there have been advances since then. But these new therapies and the payment mechanisms really challenge the foundations of the system today as far as reimbursement goes. Thanks, Laura. Just a little bit about bio that you've seen here. So interestingly, the industry, not universally, but broadly, does support allowing OBAs to be pursued. And again, if a state, and there are 16 of them, that has a state plan amendment allowing an outcomes-based arrangements, it doesn't require the state to do anything, and it doesn't require a manufacturer to enter into one. It simply gives you the platform to do so and to have different conversations than can really be had today. And those conversations can ideally lead to better access while managing a budget. So that's why you've seen in some cases the industry actually supporting, or members of the industry supporting, outcomes-based arrangements and allowing Medicaid programs to do this, because the goal for all of us as speakers here is to expand the access. And then, of course, I have to talk about the other side of that. How much does it cost? And how do you handle that, again, as the appropriators? So that's the dynamic here. And that's why, as a former Medicaid director, I look at these favorably. Again, it doesn't require a Medicaid director to enter into these, but it changes the conversation, and it allows the Medicaid director to ask the question that I often asked of vendors who came to see me as a Medicaid director. And I'm sure anyone here who's in the Medicaid division knows that they get seen by vendors a lot. And I would listen intently and then say, great, you just told me this is going to save me X amount a year, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, what if it doesn't? Or what if it only does half of what you said? Is there some kind of contingency plan for that financially? And frankly, I didn't hear back from many of those folks. And it became known pretty soon that, okay, if you go in to see Heifetz, he's going to ask you that question. So is it worth going to see him? Do you have an answer to that question, or do you not? And this fits in right with that philosophy. Medicaid directors are typically not clinical people. I certainly never wanted to be in a position of saying no because something cost too much. And fortunately, I never was. I've never been in a career position where I've been asked to do that, private or public sector. But these decisions come about, and something comes that hits an area of public policy that isn't fully vetted yet. And in a Medicaid program, that's happening, in real time with a real patient like Lucy Boo or some other family with a different condition. And a decision has to be made. And I was in the fortunate position of, okay, it's a few $1 million out of a $9 billion budget. We're going to figure it out, and no one here is going to play God. But when 10 to 20 of these come out a year, and it's 2030, and you've had a few years of this happening, this is going to be a different kind of conversation where you as legislators will have to decide, wow, this is a huge hit on the budget. It's not just a couple million that we know the agency can manage. This is a different type of dynamic that's coming. So the positives are clear, but there are some difficult choices that will have to be made along the way. Outcomes-based arrangements simply allow a different way to approach these. And you see on the map, it's about 16 states that have state plan amendments to allow these. Some of them have pursued them. It is often proprietary, so it's difficult if an actual contract has been signed between a manufacturer and a Medicaid program or a commercial payer to see what those terms are. And that makes a lot of sense, but it's gaining steam. And more folks like you, you're more advanced simply because you have a caucus that you do in this field. But more and more legislators and executive branch folks are learning about these and are trying to learn more about them because of what is coming. And again, what's coming is very positive. This is amazing. And the doctor spoke to what it was like 20 years ago versus today. Lucy Boo gave you really difficult details of her condition that hopefully could be addressed when these come down the line. And equity hangs over much of this as well. Who gets great care and who doesn't get great care? Who has the access to these therapies and who doesn't? And with sickle cell, that condition affects predominantly the African-American community. So there are a number of things to think about in all of these. And in a state like Wisconsin, we were a small state. So with some of these diseases, it would be 1 or 2 members. But with some of these other conditions, it's going to be hundreds, if not thousands. And as you get to a larger, more populous state, you can do the math on that. So there are difficult things happening, but people are addressing them with some creativity. And that's really the main request here, is to approach these with a creative thought in mind, hold folks accountable. A lot of this will get down to deep contracting levels, which we won't talk about today, but there's an accountability that the industry is generally offering here that is newer, at least from my time around Medicaid, where that conversation really wasn't happening. But I think folks are all realizing, all of the stakeholders, that we have to get creative in this world, of these therapies, because of the price, because of what they can do, and because of the cost of not providing access. I mean, a member with hemophilia still costs, on the low side, $250,000 a year. And on the high side, $750,000 a year. And they may not leave Medicaid for a very long time because of that stability of having that coverage and not wanting to risk it in a different market, commercial or otherwise. So with these therapies could come a side benefit of people who otherwise would stay on the program, taking the new job, taking the raise, taking more hours, being more healthy to do more on their employment side and in other aspects of their life. And perhaps they then go into the commercial world. But yeah, that's almost a secondary component of this. We have to take one step at a time here, and find some mechanisms that can work for the patients and for the policymakers. So with that, I think that concludes my side. Hope it wasn't too much of a buzzkill talking about the things that, frankly, all of you are going to have to talk about and make those same types of decisions. So appreciate your time and willingness to hear us all out.
Well, certainly appreciate all of you being here today. And it is incredibly frustrating to live in a system that's constrained by the cost of saving a life. And that's, where we're at, unfortunately, and the reality of things. I think knowing that all of these things are coming down the pipeline is incredibly thrilling. And, thank you so much, Luzabu, for bringing some humanness to this discussion, because I think so often, and you as well, Jody, so often it's easy to either talk about the science or talk about the money, talk about the policy involved, and forget that we're talking about human lives here and how transformational these therapies can really be. And that we need to prepare as a state for what is coming down the pike. And, I think that's going to take a collaboration of several committees here in the legislature. And that's why we as a caucus think it's really important that we exist to sort of act as that conduit between committees such as insurance. I know we have one of our esteemed co-chairs of the insurance committee here, as well as the public health committee, commerce committee, and, obviously aging committees. There's just so much crossover. With that, certainly happy to take some questions. And I see Representative Steinberg has a question or a comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael, I have to admit, I'm quite intrigued by the innovative payment model system. I was not familiar with that until your presentation today. It strikes me, though, that the determination of the success of outcomes is particularly challenging. Is that something that's specific into a contract between somebody from the industry and those benefiting from it? How do you determine what is successful for so many different kinds of therapies?
Thank you, Representative, and I'll defer to my colleagues as well on some of this because you're getting into a little bit of the science, but conceptually it is contractual and it would be spelled out in the arrangement between a payer Medicaid program, for example, and the manufacturer who's providing the therapy. And with the providers themselves, the doctors, nurses, et cetera, determining what an appropriate expectation is for the outcome for that patient, and the Medicaid program concurring with that. Medicaid programs have chief medical officers and other resources. But then there may be a third party desired to have the determination of, is it working or is it not? That could be an academic research institution. In states like yours, that's probably a easier option than in some other states, but it can be resolved nonetheless in other places. So it would be contractual is the short answer. I will defer to Dr. Rector Luzibu or others to determine the difficulty of it, which I believe would vary by condition, but I'll stop there. I've gone too far on clinical.
Thanks for the question. In hemophilia, the value-based reimbursement is actually rather simple, where some outcomes are followed, particularly the use of the very expensive currently available factor concentrates or other prevention medicine. So if someone does not have to go back to their previous therapies, that would be considered a success.
The reason I raised the question, thank you for those answers, is that there's tremendous pressure on the industry to have successful therapies and to get them approved by the FDA. And if these contractual arrangements are written in such a way to promote success or the interpretation of success in order to facilitate a verdict of safe and effective, is that necessarily in the consumer's interest?
I think that's a really astute question. And that's why it's so important that governmental oversight is part of this, that these contracts need to, particularly for public payer, that these contracts need to be overseen by the government. So it's not just one little outcome that might not really have that much of an impact on a person's life, that it's something that's clinically meaningful. Through my work with the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation, we are undertaking a new effort to make sure that we include what they have identified themselves as the lived experience experts, the people who are impacted by these conditions, whether they have it, whether a family member has it, or whether they're a caregiver of someone who has it. They're involved in all the research that we're doing, in all the programming that we're doing to make sure that the kind of programs, the kind of research, the kind of outcomes that we're investigating have meaning to them as individuals.
I ask one quick follow-up. You mentioned that there were a number of states that were moving along this path. Do we have any history yet, really, of the degree to which this has been a successful approach?
The short answer is we do not yet. These are new. Some states have the authority to do them, but haven't yet engaged in them. You do need willing partners, the Medicaid agency or the state government and the manufacturer itself. So we're seeing a lot of patient advocacy on these as well in various states to encourage the access components of this. You hear Luzibu here today, and then there are others, eloquent like her talking about these to other state governments. So the short answer is no. But to Dr. Reck's point, the oversight is important, and measuring the outcomes, right? Measuring the outcomes of the clinical therapy and then measuring the outcomes of the public policy. They go together in that regard.
Thank you. I just think that we do need a lot more experience, particularly the construction of these contracts whereby if we could establish some best practices, even with the great variability in terms of the therapy and what the outcomes could be, to provide adequate protections for all those involved. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. And your question is particularly apropos of the news this morning on genomics and ALS. If anybody's sort of opened a newspaper today or an online paper, and certainly a roller coaster, science is a roller coaster, right? We, test and retest and have some failures along the way and hopefully some positive outcomes. Senator Wong, followed by Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank the panelists, but particularly Ms. Chavanes, thank you for bringing that perspective of why we do what we do in supporting the Bioscience Caucus. But it's important to kind of differentiate the payer marketplace you're talking about. We have the prior marketplace with Medicaid, but you're proposing this innovative outcome-based arrangement. I think it's a innovative aspect of looking, but you could potentially fall into that by being picking winners and losers with outcome based in the agreement that's being determined by organizations, by entities. How do you address that question?
That's a great question. And we pick winners and losers a lot today, just in the broader sense of public policies. But in these situations, depending on which coverage approaches an OBA first, which drug company comes to the table, and which Medicaid department says, you know what, we've got the agreement, this can work, and which state government allows or establishes the oversight to make it work, that itself will be picking winners and losers. Someone will go first. Some therapy or condition will become the first one, and then it will become more common than some others, perhaps. And then, so we're picking in that sort of default way. But your question is a difficult one, and society struggles with it. Public policymakers struggle with it all the time, in the Medicaid universe particularly. So I don't have a silver bullet on that one, but some experience in this regard would be very helpful. And it's going to take some folks to make a little bit of a jump, but with the accountability and metrics behind it, so that jump is an objective one that can be measured. And then you can determine, hey, this worked really well, and let's expand it over here, or it may not be appropriate over on this side. So, that's sort of my diplomatic non-answer to a great question.
No, I appreciate that. And as a follow-up on that, there are advocates that says, let's only look at the Medicaid population, the artificially managed marketplace, where we can kind of manage and review the cost. How do you say that to only the Medicaid population and being able to look at this kind of genomic and rare disease therapies?
Well, that's one solution to what I just described as taking that first step. Someone, somewhere, some market doing it. So Medicaid could be that, and often is in a great place to experiment in some regard. But the commercial market is struggling with the same financial and access challenges that we're discussing here today, and they're a little more advanced behind the scenes in getting ready for those contractual discussions and processes and determining the clinical outcomes and the efficacy. So I don't know that, there should be a policy from on high that Medicaid should do this only and not the commercial market, or vice versa. Mm-hmm. I think we need to, let the market to a degree determine that, but encouraging Medicaid departments to do it, because Medicaid departments often are facing different public policy dynamics than a commercial insurer. And Medicaid, we spoke to the equity issue a little while ago. Medicaid is dealing with folks of limited resources just by its very nature. And that has access dynamics attached to it. So we could make a theoretical argument that Medicaid should go aggressively, but there's no reason to exclude any component of the marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, make no mistake about it. We are the Bioscience Caucus. We support the great work of our companies and innovators in that arena. Look, medical innovation is absolutely essential for us to be a world leader. And these companies need to recoup their R&D investments in order to be able to do business. But also, I think it was mentioned earlier, the esteemed chair of the insurance committee is present in this meeting, and I am the ranking member. It all boils down to, make no mistake about it, these kind of solutions make differences in people's lives. And when they're your loved ones, there is no dollar evaluation to it. But that being said, for us as policymakers, we need to look at mandates. We need to look at cost. When you talk about double-digit health insurance rate increases, it becomes untenable. There's that tug of war. So we're not going to solve that question here, but I think the key for me in the Bioscience Caucus is the co-chair. Make no mistake about it. We need to innovate. We need to be world-class in what we do in saving people's lives. But where do we go to implementing it? And where is the role of government in being able to maintain that cost versus insurance cost? And I think that is the most difficult question we're going to deal with in regards to these kind of innovations. Who's paying for it and how are we paying for it? So I know this is an ongoing discussion, but for me, it's encouraging that we have opportunities to save people's lives and to make lives better. And pretty soon may have Luzbez, I gotta say that name right. Maybe you'll be out there dancing all night long with those new hips and have a healthy prospects for a fruitful and healthy life into the future. But ongoing discussion, and thank you, Madam Chair, for the indulgence of questions.
Thank you, Senator Wong. Representative Cheeseman, followed by Representative Wood.
Thank you very much. First, a question, then a brief comment to Dr. Recht. You mentioned all the different, body systems, diseases where these new gene therapies are applicable and are being developed. Are there particular diseases that are the most likely for, therapies that we can see in the short term? And what are the ones that are most challenging as you go forward?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I come at this from a pediatric perspective. As a pediatric hematologist, I pay more attention to what's going on in pediatrics. Certainly in the adult world, the cancer therapy is being revolutionized, where individuals with tumors that don't respond to standard chemotherapy or even newer immunotherapy now have some options in clinical trials where tumor fighting cells can be engineered for them in particular. In pediatrics, where we've seen the greatest impact so far have been in some of the developmental and neurologic conditions, spinal muscular atrophy. This is a condition where children are born completely healthy, but because of a defect in a specific gene, they lose essentially all neurologic function and usually die by the time they're 12 months or 18 months of age. There is gene therapy approved for that condition right now. It has been on the market for about 3 years, and it has been incredibly successful. Where things don't work is where it's harder to get the genes. So sometimes adult neurologic conditions, for example, it's hard to get genes into your brain. So those conditions have been a little harder, but it's 2023. The rate of innovation in biomedical sciences is astounding, and what we're learning every year just grows by logarithms. So I think this is just really technology issue more than an issue with the potential, right? We're all thinking about these things. And like I said, when I was running through that slide deck, there are hundreds and hundreds of clinical trials going on right now that I think we have a great possibility of turning into real transformative medications in the future.
Thank you. And just a quick comment, having lived in the UK for 12 years under a single payer system, this question of cost and how we pay for these treatment is not confined to this country. My late husband, who was a type 1 diabetic and end-stage renal failure, Had we been in the UK, he would not have been on a kidney transplant list simply because, the decisions made, it is not worth saving a 62-year-old was so we are all in this together as these treatments that are life-altering and life-saving come forward. They do come with a cost. And the question, as Jody said, how are these decisions being made? How do we create a system where we can maximize the number of people who can benefit them and still, as a society, be able to afford everything else? So I want to thank you for your answers, and thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Wood, followed by Representative Dillon.
Hi, good morning. As chair of the Insurance and Real Estate Committee, I found the payer part fascinating. So we pass an OBA tomorrow. What does that look like? Is that something unique for each state? Do we base that on our data? Do we base that, we're doing a benchmark here in Connecticut, so we actually have more data available than we've had in recent years, but I don't really understand what an OBA would look like for each state.
That's another question, and it's going to be different for each state in all likelihood. Each state will have different clinical needs that are of priority, for lack of a better term. The advocacy community in each state will be different for different conditions and therapies, and each state may or may not have, that background or backbone economically of a bio center, so that will impact it as well. Sophistication of Medicaid programs will also have an impact, and those vary around the country, as we can see with the redetermination process. I won't say anything more about that today, not asked to. So it will look different in each state, but for a particular therapy and for a group of patients that may look alike, with all the cautions that each patient is different, in parentheses here, and actually in bold parentheses, there could be similarities, and states can lean on one another as these become more common and find out how each state does it. Those conversations regarding Medicaid happen all the time. Medicaid directors and Medicaid programs talk to each other all of the time about 100 different dynamics in their state that they're trying to resolve, that another state may have had a more advanced strategy to resolve. And that crosses any partisan line. No one cares who the governor is when they're a Medicaid director and calling the other Medicaid director to find out how they handled a particular problem. So there'll be a learning that goes with this that will be shared purposefully, but it will look different each place. And the first few will be the more challenging. But again, it's going to take some folks with some thought and leadership to engage in that realm, with that bottom line purpose of providing the access that all of us think is necessary and ideal.
We are known as the insurance capital of the world here in Connecticut. So I would assume that the carriers have data that is also valuable to that unique arrangement. So no state has passed this, it sounds like.
States have passed it in the sense of having the legal authority at the state and federal levels to pursue OBAs. It's then up to that state and a manufacturer to sign on the dotted line.
Understand. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You know what might be helpful as a follow-up to that, you had a slide of the 15 or so other states. You don't have to put it up, but it may be helpful for us as a caucus to receive information about what those 15 or so other states are doing with respect to OBAs, just so we have that sort of summary before us and understand what the landscape looks like nationally.
Yeah, we'll send the PowerPoint out and some more information on what the other states are doing as follow-up.
Thank you so much. Representative Dillon online.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very quickly, because I'm going to leave in a second. I wanted to raise the possibility of pulling data from our Medicaid and from possibly the cost that we're spending on our corrections health costs, to see whether we can get a sense of what we're spending already on certain kinds of conditions that might be included in the universe of these kinds of therapies. So that's one. It's just a suggestion so that I understand we're going to look at it in terms of a new expenditure, but I wonder if there's a potential for cost savings. And the second is on safety. The comment about factor VIII and the mortality of folks who had hemophilia, easily half of them had already been exposed before the virus had even been isolated. So depending on how you look at that very complicated period, it could be an argument for more bench science, not less. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative. Your data comment, your first comment there is right on point. And that's what really this will come down to in many ways is how well do these work? How do we collect the data? What are our costs today versus what would our costs be tomorrow with an OBA in place for various conditions and therapies? Because I think when people see a high price tag on something and there's sticker shock, and I understand that, we still have to think about, okay, but what happens if the patient just goes about the normal treatment that's been around for 20 years and isn't really solving the problem? And Medicaid particularly is in it for the long term. It's looking at a budget, but it's not necessarily looking at a bottom line stock price or anything like that. And it has a different way to look at these things. And just from a structural perspective, it has the data. Medicaid has a ton of data. There are levels of sophistication in pulling that data and utilizing that data, but those are problems that can all be solved. The data is there, and the commercial side has the data. As a former health plan CEO, the things I had on my desk every morning, it was actually amazing, the kinds of things we knew about our patient base and where we really needed to improve and where we needed to work with providers harder on certain things. So that's a great point. The correction system doesn't get talked about a lot in this realm. There are probably a lot of ethical dynamics that go into that as well, which I won't go into today, and that would be on your plate as well. But it speaks to the data and the volume and how are we measuring success. And part of the dynamic is with some of these drugs and therapies that the trials are so small, just because the condition isn't very common, fortunately. The trials are so small, it's really hard to draw huge conclusions from them. And then if you have a fast-paced approval process, that further constrains the information you may have. So the data is huge to all of these conversations and will be huge in any actual contract between a program or payer and a manufacturer.
Well, I just want to say we'll end it there. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us today, both legislators online, in person, and all the folks presenting today. You've given us a lot of food for thought. I remember when I was first running for this seat in 2018, Senator Hartley came up to me and said, watch genomics. That's the future. So, and I see she's joined us online, the esteemed co-chair of the Commerce Committee, and also a champion for bioscience in Connecticut. But again, just want to thank everybody for being with us today. Please look out for another meeting coming up in a couple of months of this caucus. We'll be discussing the overall landscape of life sciences and policies that may or may not be before us, that we will be sort of delving into and seeing how that may help shape bioscience going forward. So thanks again, everybody, for being with us today, and we'll talk soon.